In the summer of 1904, St. Louis was overflowing with people. The World's Fair had turned the city into a showcase of the modern age. New machines, new foods, new inventions. And somewhere among the crowds, an ice cream seller had a problem. He had ice cream, he had customers, but he didn't have enough dishes to serve them. Next door, a Syrian immigrant named Ernest Hamwi was selling thin Persian-style waffles. According to the story that became attached to the event, the two businesses found an unexpected solution. The waffle was rolled, the ice cream went inside, and one of the most recognizable foods in America suddenly had a new form, the ice cream cone. The story is more complicated than the legend. An Italian immigrant named Italo Marchini had already patented an edible ice cream cone mold in 1903, and there were earlier European examples of serving cream in cone-shaped wafers. But the 1904 World's Fair helped turn the cone into something Americans could recognize instantly. And that matters, because ice cream had spent most of its history doing the exact opposite. For centuries, it was difficult to make, difficult to freeze, difficult to transport, difficult to store, and expensive enough that, for much of its early history, ordinary people could not simply walk into a store and buy a scoop. Yet within a few decades, ice cream would be rolling through American neighborhoods on trucks. Children would hear the bell, families would keep it in their freezers, and an entire generation would grow up believing that ice cream had always been there. It hadn't. The history of ice cream is really the history of a problem. How do you make something cold and keep it cold long enough for somebody to enjoy it? Every solution created another problem. Every breakthrough made ice cream more available, and every time it became easier to make, someone found a new way to sell it. This is the story of how frozen water, sugar, milk, machinery, refrigeration, immigration, industry, war, advertising, and American nostalgia combined to create one of the world's most familiar desserts. And the strange part is that the story doesn't really begin with ice cream. It begins with people trying to defeat summer. 1. Before ice cream, there was ice. Long before refrigerators, freezers, supermarkets, or even the modern idea of dessert, human beings had already discovered something extraordinary. Cold could be stored. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers had ice houses where snow and ice could be preserved for use during hot weather. In ancient Greece, snow was transported and sold. Roman elites enjoyed chilled drinks and desserts. The point wasn't yet ice cream. The point was status. Cold was valuable because cold was difficult. If you lived in a hot climate, the ability to produce something cold in summer meant that somebody, somewhere, had solved an engineering problem. Where did the ice come from? How was it transported? How was it protected from heat? And how long could it survive? These questions mattered because ice was not simply sitting in a freezer waiting to be used. It had to be harvested, stored, and guarded. And that immediately created a social divide. The wealthy could afford cold. Everyone else had summer. Across Asia and the Middle East, different civilizations developed their own answers. Persian engineers constructed enormous underground ice storage structures known as yakshals. These structures could preserve ice through remarkably hot conditions. The frozen material could then be used to cool food and drinks. And eventually, people discovered something even better. You didn't have to eat ice by itself. You could use it to transform other foods. Persian traditions produced frozen desserts, such as faluda, made with chilled ingredients, including thin noodles and sweetened flavors. The Islamic world developed and spread traditions of sweetened chilled drinks known as sharbat. In India, kulfi emerged as a dense frozen milk dessert. In China, historical sources describe chilled dairy preparations, including mixtures involving milk and other ingredients. None of this means that one civilization simply invented ice cream and handed the finished recipe to everybody else. That's one of the biggest myths surrounding the dessert. The real story is much more interesting. Different cultures were independently discovering the same basic principle. If you can obtain ice and control temperature, you can transform food. But there was still a major obstacle. Cold alone wasn't enough. You needed to freeze a liquid, and that was much harder. Imagine putting a bowl of cream into ordinary ice. It gets cold, but it doesn't necessarily become ice cream. The temperature needs to fall far enough, and it needs to fall quickly enough. Then someone discovered a trick: salt. When salt is added to ice, it lowers the freezing point of the resulting mixture. The ice begins melting, but in the process, the ice and salt mixture becomes colder than ice alone. That cold environment can pull heat out of another container. Suddenly, freezing wasn't just something nature did. It was something humans could control. This was a fundamental turning point, because now you could place a container of sweetened milk or cream into a bath of ice and salt and begin freezing it. The mixture could be stirred. The crystals could be broken apart. The result could become smoother. And the basic mechanical principle behind old-fashioned ice cream was born. Ice cream was no longer merely frozen food. It was a technological process. But technology creates its own problem. You need ice. Lots of it. And before artificial refrigeration, ice was a seasonal resource. That meant that ice cream remained difficult. The dessert could exist, but making enough of it for everyone was another matter. For centuries, ice cream remained closer to a luxury than an everyday food. Then Europe discovered it, and the dessert entered a completely different world. By the 17th century, frozen desserts were becoming increasingly sophisticated in Europe. Italian cooks developed elaborate frozen preparations. French cooks refined custards and frozen creams. English aristocratic households experimented with increasingly elaborate desserts. And suddenly, ice cream was becoming fashionable. But there was a catch. It was still expensive. You needed cream. You needed sugar. You needed ice. You needed salt. You needed equipment. And you needed someone willing to spend time making the dessert. That combination made ice cream an ideal luxury. It could be served at banquets. It could impress guests. It could demonstrate wealth. And it could make a host look sophisticated. The dessert wasn't simply something you ate. It was evidence that you could afford to make it. This is where another famous story appears. Catherine de' Medici is often credited with bringing ice cream from Italy to France when she married Henry II. Marco Polo is similarly credited with bringing frozen desserts from China to Italy. Both stories are wonderfully convenient. Both are also far less certain than the popular versions suggest. There is no reliable evidence that Marco Polo brought ice cream from China to Italy, and Catherine de' Medici's supposed role in introducing ice cream to France is largely a later legend. The truth doesn't need the myth. Frozen desserts were already developing through multiple culinary traditions, and Europe gradually combined several of them. The important development wasn't one famous person carrying a secret recipe across a continent. It was the gradual combination of techniques: sweetened dairy, custards, frozen fruit preparations, ice storage, salt, sugar, and increasingly sophisticated kitchen equipment. Eventually, the technology crossed the Atlantic. And in America, something changed. Ice cream stopped being merely a European luxury. It became part of American culture. 4. Ice cream enters America. In colonial America, ice cream was still a special occasion food. Ice was difficult to obtain. Sugar was expensive, and refrigeration didn't exist. But wealthy households could solve the problem. They could build ice houses. They could have ice harvested in winter. They could preserve it underground, and they could use it during the summer. This created a peculiar situation. The American colonies had enormous amounts of frozen water available during winter. What they lacked was a convenient way to preserve it. So an industry eventually grew around solving exactly that problem. But before that happened, ice cream acquired some famous American fans. George Washington liked it. Thomas Jefferson liked it even more. Jefferson encountered frozen desserts while serving in France and later brought recipes and culinary knowledge back with him. He even developed a famous recipe for vanilla ice cream. In 1802, ice cream was being served at the White House, and Jefferson had an ice house at Monticello. But there is something important about these stories. The presidents could enjoy ice cream because they had access to the infrastructure required to make it. Most Americans didn't. Ice cream was still dependent on wealth. Then America found a way to make ice itself into a business. And one man became famous for betting that people would pay to buy winter in the middle of summer. His name was Frederick Tudor. 5. The Ice King. Frederick Tudor looked at frozen ponds in New England and saw a business opportunity. Ice was everywhere. The problem was getting it somewhere that didn't have any. Tudor began harvesting ice and shipping it. At first, the idea looked ridiculous. Why would anyone pay to have something shipped that nature produced for free? But Tudor understood something that other people didn't. In a hot climate, ice wasn't worthless. It was valuable. If you could preserve it during transportation, you could sell cold drinks. You could preserve food. You could make frozen desserts. You could change how people experienced summer. Tudor eventually built a large commercial ice business, sending American ice to places far beyond New England. This was more important than it sounds, because ice was becoming infrastructure. And once ice becomes infrastructure, ice cream changes with it. The dessert no longer depends entirely on an aristocrat's private ice house. It can begin moving into public life. But another problem remained. Even with ice available, making ice cream by hand was hard. Someone had to stir the mixture. Someone had to manage the ice. Someone had to keep the freezing process under control. And then, in 1843, an inventor named Nancy Johnson changed the process. Nancy Maria Donaldson Johnson patented a hand-cranked ice cream freezer in 1843. The invention was simple. A container sat inside a larger vessel holding ice and salt. Inside the container was the ice cream mixture. A rotating dasher stirred it. The stirring helped produce a smoother texture while the cold mixture froze. Suddenly, making ice cream was easier and more reliable. This is the kind of invention that rarely gets remembered. There is no giant machine, no dramatic explosion, no famous laboratory, just a better bucket. But better buckets can change civilizations, because Johnson's freezer helped move ice cream from the professional kitchen toward the ordinary household. The problem had changed. People could make ice cream. Now someone had to figure out how to sell it. And one of the people who helped do that was Augustus Jackson. Jackson was an African-American chef and confectioner associated with the White House in the early 19th century. After leaving that work, he established a catering business in Philadelphia and became involved in ice cream production. He developed flavors and techniques and sold ice cream to parlors and distributors. The significance isn't simply that Jackson made ice cream. It's that the American ice cream industry was becoming an ecosystem. There were makers, there were suppliers, there were distributors, there were inventors, there were customers, and there were businesses that could produce the dessert on a much larger scale. Then another entrepreneur recognized the next opportunity, Jacob Fussell, 7, when ice cream became an industry. In 1851, Jacob Fussell established what is widely recognized as America's first commercial ice cream factory in Baltimore. And Fussell had discovered the real secret, scale. If you make ice cream one batch at a time, the cost is high. But if you make huge quantities, distribute them, and sell them to stores, the economics change. Ice cream stops being something a household occasionally makes. It becomes a product. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout the next century. First comes a problem. Someone invents a solution. The solution makes the product cheaper. The cheaper product reaches more people. More people create more demand. More demand creates a bigger industry. And the bigger industry demands another invention. Ice cream was entering that cycle. But there was still one enormous limitation: transportation. You could manufacture ice cream in Baltimore. But how did you get it to Washington? Or Philadelphia? Or New York? Without refrigeration, every mile was a battle against heat. The solution would not come from ice cream makers. It would come from engineers. And eventually, the entire food system would change. 8. The machine that defeated summer. During the 19th century, refrigeration technology advanced. Artificial ice became possible. Mechanical refrigeration developed. Railroads expanded. Cities grew. And the ability to move perishable foods over long distances began to transform American life. Ice cream benefited enormously. But the most important change wasn't simply that people could freeze things. It was that they could control temperature. That distinction matters. For most of human history, food preservation depended on nature. Winter meant cold. Summer meant decay. A cold night could help. A hot day could ruin everything. Refrigeration began to break that relationship. The calendar became less important, and ice cream became less seasonal. But the next transformation would be even bigger, because freezing food wasn't enough. It had to survive transportation. It had to retain its texture. It had to reach consumers without becoming a melted disaster. Then a curious American inventor named Clarence Birdseye noticed something in Labrador. Fresh fish froze almost immediately in the Arctic cold, and when it thawed, it still tasted fresh. Birdseye realized that the speed of freezing mattered. Fast freezing created smaller ice crystals. Smaller crystals caused less damage to food. That insight helped him develop commercial quick freezing technology in the 1920s. Birdseye was not simply inventing frozen peas, he was helping create the modern frozen food system. And ice cream was perfectly positioned to benefit. Because once Americans could manufacture, transport, and store frozen food reliably, the freezer was no longer just a tool. It was becoming part of everyday life. 9. Ice cream leaves the parlor. By the late 19th century, ice cream was no longer confined to wealthy dining rooms. It was becoming part of American public life. Ice cream parlors appeared, soda fountains appeared, ice cream gardens became gathering places, and something else was happening. The temperance movement was challenging alcohol consumption. For many Americans, ice cream parlors offered an alternative social environment. A person could go out, meet friends, drink something sweet, and eat ice cream without going into a saloon. During Prohibition, this role became even more significant. Ice cream wasn't just dessert anymore. It was becoming a place, a social activity, a reason to leave the house. And that opened the door to another transformation. The dessert became portable. The cone. 10. The cone changes the game. Before the cone became common, eating ice cream usually meant a dish, a glass, or a spoon. That seems like a small inconvenience. It wasn't. Because the moment the container becomes edible, ice cream can go almost anywhere. A fair, a park, a sidewalk, a boardwalk, a baseball game, a street corner. And in 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair became the stage for the cone's breakthrough. Again, the exact story is disputed. The famous account says Ernest Hamwi, a Syrian immigrant selling waffles, helped solve an ice cream vendor's shortage of dishes by rolling his waffle into a cone. But the Smithsonian notes that Italo Marchiani had already patented an edible cone mold in 1903. So the fair probably didn't produce the cone from nothing. It popularized it. And that distinction tells us something important about innovation. History rarely happens because one person wakes up and invents an entire future. More often, several people are solving the same problem. One person creates a tool, another improves it, someone else finds a commercial use. Then an event makes the idea visible. And suddenly, everyone remembers the moment. The cone gave ice cream freedom. Now it could travel. But the next innovation would give it wheels. 11. The ice cream man. In 1920, in Youngstown, Ohio, confectioner Harry Burt developed a chocolate-coated ice cream bar on a stick. The problem was simple. Ice cream was delicious. Chocolate coating was delicious. But eating the combination was messy. The stick solved that. Burt then equipped a fleet of motorized vending trucks with freezers and bells. The ice cream truck had arrived. Think about what had happened. A frozen dessert that once required an ice house was now being driven down residential streets. The product was no longer waiting for customers. It was coming to them. And the sound mattered. The bell became advertising. The truck became a moving store. The route became a business model. And the ice cream man became a familiar figure in American childhood. But this also reveals something deeper about American ice cream. It was becoming an experience, not just food, a sound, a place, a ritual, a summer afternoon, a few coins in a child's hand, a truck appearing at the end of the street. And that emotional connection would become one of the industry's most powerful assets. But America was about to enter one of the darkest periods in its history, and ice cream would survive it. 12. Ice cream during the Depression and war. The Great Depression changed what Americans could afford. Ice cream was still a treat, but treats became more meaningful when everyday life was difficult. Then came World War II. Ice cream did not disappear. In fact, the US military continued to serve it. Navy records show ice cream appearing in wartime meals, and naval vessels carried ice cream supplies and even ice cream making equipment. The Navy had recognized something that had been true for decades. Morale mattered. Ice cream could be a small piece of normal life in an abnormal world. That mattered to sailors far from home. It mattered to soldiers. It mattered to families. And after the war, it mattered even more. Because millions of Americans came home expecting a better life. They bought houses. They bought cars. They bought televisions. And increasingly, they bought refrigerators. 13. The freezer moves into the kitchen. This is one of the biggest turning points in the entire story. For most of history, ice cream was something you had to seek out, a special dessert, a parlor treat, something bought from a vendor, something made for an occasion. Now the refrigerator was entering the home. Electric refrigeration had begun appearing in American homes in the late 1920s, and the technology continued spreading over the following decades. And once a freezer became part of the kitchen, the relationship between Americans and ice cream changed permanently. You no longer had to wait for the ice cream man. You didn't have to visit a parlor. You didn't need to own an ice house. You could simply open the freezer. That sounds ordinary now, but historically, it is extraordinary. For thousands of years, the problem had been, how do we make cold? Then, how do we preserve cold? Then, how do we transport cold? And finally, how do we put cold inside every home? Once that last problem was solved, the ice cream industry could explode. And it did. 14. Soft serve changes the texture. But the industry wasn't finished changing. Americans weren't just buying ice cream. They were looking for new experiences, and one of the most important was soft serve. Soft serve became popular in the United States during the 1940s, although competing claims exist about exactly who invented it. Dairy Queen became one of the most recognizable businesses associated with the product. Its origins go back to 1938, when a new soft frozen dairy product was sold in Kankakee, Illinois. The company grew around the idea that ice cream didn't have to arrive as a hard scoop. It could come out of a machine. Soft, fresh, fast. Again, the same pattern appeared. A problem: hard ice cream takes time to scoop. A response: make it softer. The consequence: it becomes faster to serve. The new problem: how do you turn that speed into an enormous chain of restaurants? The answer was franchising. And now ice cream was no longer 15. The supermarket takes over. The post-war American supermarket changed the way people bought food. Instead of buying ingredients from several specialized shops, families could walk through one enormous store. And there, surrounded by frozen foods, was ice cream. The freezer case changed the relationship between consumer and product. The ice cream parlor sold an experience. The supermarket sold convenience. Now you could buy a pint and take it home. You could keep it for later. You could eat it after dinner. You could serve it to guests. Or you could hide it in the back of the freezer and hope nobody else found it. The freezer had turned ice cream into a household possession. And then advertising made it personal. Brands began competing not only on flavor but on identity. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, Rocky Road, butter pecan, mint chocolate chip, Neapolitan. Every flavor became an argument. What kind of person were you? What did you choose? What did your family buy? What did you remember? Ice cream was becoming a language of preference, and then the industry discovered something else. People didn't just want more ice cream. They wanted more kinds of ice cream. 16, from 3 flavors to thousands. For much of its early history, ice cream had a relatively narrow vocabulary. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, coffee, fruit, nuts, custard. But modern food manufacturing changed the possibilities. Factories could standardize ingredients. Flavor companies could produce extracts and concentrates. Mix-ins could be distributed consistently. Chocolate chips could be manufactured to exact specifications. Cookies could be crushed. Candy could be incorporated. Fruit could be swirled through the mixture. And the ice cream itself became a platform. This is why ice cream has survived so many food trends. It is almost infinitely adaptable. The dessert can be traditional. It can be premium. It can be cheap. It can be absurd. It can be nostalgic. It can be experimental. It can be eaten from a cone, a cup, a sandwich, a bar, a sundae, a milkshake, a pint, and occasionally something so strange that it barely resembles ice cream at all. That flexibility would become extremely important in the final decades of the 20th century because the industry was about to split in two. One side would compete on price and convenience. The other would compete on indulgence. And the premium ice cream revolution was coming. 17, the return of luxury. There is a strange reversal in the history of ice cream. Remember where we started. Ice cream was once a luxury. Then technology made it cheap. Factories made it abundant. Supermarkets made it ordinary. And once something becomes ordinary, people eventually start looking for a more expensive version of it. In 1961, Häagen-Dazs entered the American market. The brand helped popularize the idea of premium ice cream with richer ingredients and a more sophisticated image. Then, in 1978, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield opened their first shop in Burlington, Vermont. They had originally considered other food businesses but chose ice cream after taking a short course in making it. Their product emphasized large pieces, strong flavors, and combinations that were difficult to mistake for ordinary vanilla or chocolate. This was another turning point. Ice cream had become industrial. Now consumers wanted it to feel handmade again. The industry had solved the problem of making ice cream cheap. The new problem was making mass-produced ice cream feel special. So the answer was indulgence. More ingredients, more texture, more flavor, more identity. Ice cream had gone from luxury to commodity, back toward luxury. But now almost anyone could participate. That is a remarkable transformation, and it explains why ice cream never settled into one final form. Every time technology made it easier to produce, culture found a new way to make it meaningful. 18. The science inside the scoop. There is another reason ice cream has survived. It isn't just history, it's chemistry. A scoop of ice cream looks simple. Milk, cream, sugar, flavor. But inside that scoop is a carefully controlled structure. Water freezes. Fat creates richness. Sugar changes the freezing behavior. Air gets incorporated. Small ice crystals create smoothness. Large crystals create a rougher texture. Stabilizers can help control the structure. Emulsifiers help ingredients interact. The result is a food that is technically frozen, but not completely solid. That is part of the magic. Ice cream occupies a strange middle ground. It is solid enough to scoop, soft enough to melt, cold enough to numb your mouth, but flavorful enough that you keep eating it anyway. And that scientific complexity is part of why the dessert has remained so adaptable. It can be reformulated, refrigerated differently, aerated differently, frozen faster, frozen slower, served softer, served harder. The technology keeps changing. The basic pleasure doesn't. But by the late 20th century, another problem was appearing. America had too much choice. 19, when ice cream became memory. For older Americans, ice cream is rarely just ice cream. It can be a neighborhood, a restaurant, a birthday, a first date, a baseball game, a family road trip, a summer vacation, a freezer door opening after dinner, a paper cup, a wooden spoon, a metal scoop, a truck bell coming down the street. That is not accidental. Ice cream developed alongside American prosperity. It became more available as the country became more industrialized. And then advertising connected the product to childhood. The ice cream truck was especially powerful. By the 1950s, Good Humor had thousands of trucks operating across the country. The truck wasn't simply transporting food. It was transporting an event. You heard it before you saw it. And suddenly, everyone knew what time it was. Ice cream time. That is why the disappearance of an ice cream truck can feel strangely personal decades later. The product hasn't disappeared. The ritual has. And that distinction reveals something important. The history of ice cream is not really a history of frozen milk. It is a history of changing access. At first, ice cream was available to people who could afford ice. Then it became available to people who could afford refrigeration. Then to people who could afford a parlor. Then a cone. Then a truck. Then a home freezer. Eventually, it became so available that the question changed completely. Not, can we get ice cream? But, which one do we want? 20. The strange reversal. Think about the entire journey. The first challenge was cold. People needed ice, so they built ice houses. Then ice became an industry. Then mechanical refrigeration appeared. Then factories made ice cream at scale. Then transportation made it national. Then freezers put it inside homes. Then supermarkets made it routine. Then brands created hundreds of variations. And eventually, ice cream became so common that it became nostalgic. That is the reversal. Technology made ice cream less special, and culture made it special again. The freezer turned an impossible luxury into an everyday food. But once everyone could have it, the emotional value shifted. A scoop wasn't special because it was rare. It was special because it reminded you of something. This is why a simple vanilla cone can sometimes evoke more emotion than an elaborate dessert costing 10 times as much. The flavor is only part of the experience. The memory is doing the rest. And that brings us back to the beginning. The problem was never simply making ice cream. It was making ice cream possible. 21, the real history of ice cream. For thousands of years, people were fighting the same enemy: heat. They stored snow. They built underground chambers. They harvested winter ice. They experimented with salt. They developed freezing techniques. They invented hand-cranked machines. They built factories. They developed mechanical refrigeration. They invented insulated transportation. They built freezers. They created supermarkets. They put ice cream on trucks. They turned it into bars, cones, sandwiches, sundaes, soft serve, premium pints, and an almost endless number of flavors. Every generation inherited the same basic problem and solved it in a different way. But every solution created a new possibility. Ice storage made frozen desserts possible. The ice trade made them more accessible. The hand-crank freezer made them easier to make. Factories made them cheaper. Refrigeration made them easier to transport. The cone made them portable. The truck brought them to neighborhoods. The home freezer made them permanent residents of American kitchens. Supermarkets made them ordinary. Advertising made them personal. And nostalgia made them timeless. That is the hidden pattern. Ice cream did not become an American institution because somebody invented the perfect recipe. It became one because generation after generation removed another obstacle between people and something cold, sweet, and pleasurable. 22. Return to St. Louis. Now go back to St. Louis, the World's Fair. Thousands of people moving through a giant temporary city built to celebrate the future. Electricity, machinery, transportation, new foods, new ideas. And among all of that technological spectacle, something almost trivial was happening. An ice cream seller needed a container. A waffle seller had one, and the two products came together. The cone wasn't the beginning of ice cream. It wasn't even necessarily invented at that fair, but it represented something that had been happening for centuries. A problem appeared. Someone adapted. The adaptation changed the product. And the new product created a new culture around it. That is the history of ice cream in miniature. A problem, a solution, a consequence, then another problem, and another solution. Again and again. For 2,000 years, 23, the last scoop. The next time you open a freezer and see a carton of ice cream, it is easy to see only dessert. But look at what is actually there. Ancient experiments with snow, Persian ice storage, Asian frozen desserts, Middle Eastern sherbets, European custards, colonial American ice houses, Thomas Jefferson's recipes, Frederick Tudor's ice trade, Nancy Johnson's hand crank, Augustus Jackson's innovations, Jacob Fussel's factory, the railroad, mechanical refrigeration, Clarence Birdseye's quick freezing technology, the ice cream cone, the ice cream truck, the supermarket, the home freezer, the post-war American kitchen, the premium ice cream revolution, and millions of small memories. None of these things, by itself, explains why ice cream matters. Together, they do. Because the history of ice cream is really the story of technology making pleasure ordinary. Something that once required a king's kitchen and an ice house eventually became something a child could buy with a few coins. Something that once depended on winter could be eaten in July. Something that once required an entire supply chain could sit quietly behind a freezer door. And perhaps that is why ice cream has lasted. Not because it is rare, but because it is familiar. It has followed us from palaces to parlors, from parlors to sidewalks, from sidewalks to supermarkets, from supermarkets into our homes, and from our homes into memory. The most remarkable thing about ice cream is not that humans learned how to freeze cream. It is that humans spent centuries removing every obstacle between themselves and a moment of happiness. The ice house solved the first problem. The freezer solved the next. The factory solved another. The cone solved another. The truck solved another. And eventually, the refrigerator solved almost all of them. But there was one problem no machine could solve. How do you make an ordinary moment feel special? For that, we invented the ice cream truck, the summer afternoon, the cone, the first bite, and the memory that remains long after the ice cream is gone. So perhaps the history of ice cream was never really about freezing food. It was about making something temporary last. The ice melts, the scoop disappears, the truck drives away. But somehow, the memory stays cold and sweet and waiting for us in the freezer. So here's the question. What moment in the history of ice cream do you think changed it forever? The invention of the freezer, the rise of the ice cream factory, the cone, the ice cream truck, or the refrigerator in the American home? Because whichever one you choose may reveal what you think ice cream really became: a technology, an industry, a symbol of American abundance, or simply a taste of summer that history somehow managed to preserve.